Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm glad you could be here. Let's begin by me explaining why I show some of the videos that I show. I'm very interested in understanding why things happen, and I can't really do that without looking at the past. I understand the present is pressing. As I predicted, there would be no conference in Islamabad, and as you can see, and many others have predicted it too, granted. The goal is to remove the Islamic regime and all of the tentacles that this regime uses as proxies. These proxies have to be completely neutralized, and the only way to do that is to cut off their nourishment, which is, by and large, the Islamic regime of Iran, an occupying force. Now, this is interesting. A lot of Western viewers don't really understand the complexity, and the simple fact is that it really isn't that complex. Complexity is formed in two ways. One, because the person that's explaining it doesn't really understand it, and two, they do understand it, but they want to confuse you. So they bring complexity into it. You see, it's all about activity. They're not really interested in productivity. And by they, I'm specifically talking about politicians and their mouthpiece, which tends to be the national media of their respective countries. Not just national media, but a lot of freelance journalism as well. No one is interested in simplicity. Everybody, people like to be overwhelmed by complexity because that allows them a way out to understand the situation less and to have a way out, if you like, an escape from the entire thing by saying, well, it's a very complex issue. It's not that easy to understand. No, it's very easy to understand if it's explained correctly. Everything is easy to understand if it's explained correctly. If it's simplified for you, nothing is that complex. It's very simple if you understand it, and if you accept certain parameters of definition, it would be easy for you to understand any condition and any situation. I bring it up again and again and again in all of my conversations, and I will never stop doing this because I think it's important. It's at the apogee of any conversation about Iran, about the West, about the political situation currently, wherever it is that you want to talk about. How many of you read Spanish history in Spanish or French history in French? Or how many of you read the history of Russia in Russian? Mainly, especially for the English-speaking nations, access to these histories tend to be mostly in the English language. Well, let's have a look at some of those because I think it's interesting how translations and interpretations change. But the first thing I want to start off with is Abbas Milani, who is a well-known, respected academic, whatever academic means. He has written several books, and one of his most recent books was about the Shah, where he I think outlined his own personal apology for the way that he always felt about the Shah and the Pahlavi dynasty and how wrong he was. So he basically tried to absolve himself from the entire situation. I commend him for it, but I don't necessarily forgive him for it because I think he was a fool. And to some extent, he still may be one. But let's go and have a look at this.
I knew how radical they were, most of them. There were a couple of them who were profoundly human, profoundly open. Mr. Talagani, I've written about Talagani in a book called Seymour. Talagani was as open-minded as any person I've ever seen, but there were others who were just truly remarkable. But at that time, this is 2.5 years before the revolution. If you had told any of these people, any of them, that within 2.5 years you would rule Iran, they would suggest you go see a psychiatrist. They had not a dream even. And, this isn't just true about Iran. Other revolutions are the same. I mean, Trotsky was on his way to America when the revolution happened. They didn't think that the Bolsheviks had a distant possibility. But not only they didn't know, the remarkable thing is that the Shah's regime had no clue. Mm-hmm. The Shah's regime believed that their main enemy were the left, which was a minor, small group, or the misunderstandings, which were larger in number, but still no threat. And they thought the clergy are their allies in the fight against these two. 2 years before the revolution, and I heard this, and I've said this long ago before, and it's been confirmed from many other sources. 2.5 years before the revolution, the Savak gave these clergy, the future leaders of the revolution, the option to sign a note that says, we will criticize the regime as much as we criticize the left and Mossadeghists. If you sign that petition, they'll let you go. 2.5 years. And some of them signed and were let go. Mm. That's how wrong they were strategically. Mm-hmm. The CIA missed it just as much. The British intelligence missed it just as much. These are the two sources that I've had access to. Every evidence is that the Soviets missed it. The Israelis missed it. So that sort of a chasm between the reality and the Shah's perception of who his enemies were, I think is one key to understanding why the revolution happened and why the clergy won. Mm-hmm.
Okay, why did I include Abbas Milani in this is because I want to make the point that even the academics get it wrong too. They're not privy to everything, obviously not. All academics can do is revisit documents, recordings, and so on. But not everything is in documents and recordings. You can't ascertain all of the information that isn't written down. There are many unofficial meetings. There are many meetings that are held where no minutes are taken. So his argument here is somewhat very vague. He says that the mistake that the Shah's secret police made, that the CIA didn't understand, British intelligence, even the Israelis missed, was that these people could come to power. Well, there's a very simple reason for that. The reason why they missed it was because they were not, first of all, the Israelis were not included in that plan. The French, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Helmut Schmidt of Germany, James Callaghan of England, and of course the famous peanut farmer, James Carter from the United States. All these four so-called leaders met on the island of Guadeloupe and decided the fate of Iran and the Shah of Iran. 9 days later, the Shah was gone, and this Guadeloupe conference was held on the 4th of January to the 7th in 1979. The island where the leaders met to decide the fate of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, in Guadeloupe. As I said, the French Giscard d'Estaing, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and so on. Obviously, Abbas Milani hasn't looked at this incident. Were there any records? Well, obviously there must have been. But anyway, let's go to the next video. There's a few of them. It's a very important documentary that was made a few years ago. It was called Iran and the West by the BBC. What is it? Even a broken clock tells the right time twice a day. Well, on one of these right times, it seems to have fallen on the lap of the BBC to do so, because it was actually a good documentary. Somewhat naively made, I think, and perhaps inaccurately. But, it's an interesting source of information. Let me take you to it.
Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled Iran for almost 40 years.
شاهنشاه‌ها کشور شاهنشاهی ایران به مردم این سرزمین باستانی.
He lived in a world apart from his people. He was kept in power by a vicious security service and the fifth largest army on earth, equipped with American weaponry. He ignored calls for democracy. He let the nation's vast oil wealth go only to the few. He promoted Western culture, enraging millions of Muslims. Many groups resented the Shah. They came together under Khomeini's banner.
I also want to come back to the part where the documentary says that the wealth of the nation was only allocated to a few. And they show all of these supermarkets filled with stuff, and people were buying, and how he was modernizing the country too fast, westernizing it, which the religious people disliked and hated. Well, on the one hand, they say he was only, the wealth of the country was only benefiting a few. And then the religious people were also against the modernization and the westernization of the country. A bit contradictory there. And of course, this wasn't true. Most of the schools and the hospitals that were being built in Iran in the 1970s were actually in rural areas. So these would have been areas, supposedly, mostly dominated by people who were not factory workers, who were not administrative people, who were not clerical staff and so forth. They were usually farmers and village dwellers and so on. Well, schools were being built for them and hospitals and so on. This was happening everywhere, going on everywhere in the country. You know, a lot of people at the time, in the 1950s and even in the 1960s in Iran, didn't even have birth certificates. They certainly didn't have driving licenses, and very, very few even had passports. This wasn't because Iran was less democratic than anywhere else. It wasn't the system that was undemocratic. It was people's mentality was by and large very undemocratic as well. And I know this is a harsh thing to say, and even a harsher one to hear, but it's true. You can see it going on now in Western countries where people's ideas and mentalities are in some ways going backwards instead of going forwards. The progressives call progression, which is a regression in some ways. They're regressing, but they think it's being progressive. Dismantling institutions and getting a lot of cultural aspects and ideas they see as being progressive. Well, in Iran, it was by and large, to some extent, as far as some people were concerned, it was exactly the same. It wasn't that the country was undemocratic, it was people's approach and mentality was just generally undemocratic. And the proof of it, once the 1979 revolution happens, look at what happens to Iran. Doesn't progress, it regresses. It goes backwards. So what happened to this want of democracy and so forth? And of course, you know, academics and a lot of Western commentators will tell you, well, it was stolen from the people. No, it wasn't. It wasn't stolen. There was nothing to steal. The only problem the Iranian population had at the time, and not a large percentage, a small percentage, was that they were just simply anti-Shah. And we can discuss that at some point, what exactly that was and why they were anti-Shah. And possibly more specifically why they were anti-Pahlavi dynasty. That as a completely different reason. And I don't think that the two reasons are necessarily linked. Because during Mossadegh's time, the cleric went against Mossadegh because they realized that he was in breach of the constitution, and he was asking the clerics to do something that in their very own dogma they were prohibited from doing, and that was to rule the country. In the Shia doctrine, this is not allowed. Only the invisible, upon his return, can rule. Meanwhile, they're just simply guardians. Mossadegh was asking them to break their own oath and their own promise too. That's why they stepped away from him. So now you have, in 1979, the opposite takes place. The cleric do step away from guardianship into rulership, which is unprecedented. And hence the reason why the older clerics, the more learned ones at least, went against Ayatollah Khomeini and the 1979 revolution, because it wasn't just a breach of constitution and the opposition to the Pahlavi dynasty, but it was also a breach of their own oath and promise and everything that Shia Islam stood for.
President Carter turned to a general who had served in Iran.
My instructions were to give United States assurances to the military of Iran that we would support them.
His mission was to go out and see if the Iranian military had the stomach to attempt a coup and to suppress the revolution.
The general had to get the military to defend the throne while the Shah was away.
ایشون پرسیدن که آیا چه نقشه‌ای که ارتش بتونه اوضاع رو به دست بگیره چی دارین و اگر این نقشه چی میگه.
You had to have plans. You know, the immediate thought of these generals and admirals was to do what you're talking about, that they take control. But when asked how, they were speechless.
رژیم ما در اون موقع چنین اجازه ای را نمیداد. چون خب ترس این بود که یه دفعه این فکر یه روزی در ارتش پیدا نشه که خودسرانه چنین اقدامی بکنه.
In his haste, the American general had failed to pay the usual courtesy call on the Shah.
من خیلی کمتر اوقات اعلیحضرت رو اینقدر عصبانی دیدم. خیلی معذرت میخوام اگر من این کلمه رو بگم، ولی خب اعلیحضرت فرمودن که این مرتیکه آمده به ایران و تمام همه جا رفته، با همه ملاقات کرده، رئیس قره‌باقی هم دیده، حالا قبل از اینکه بره آمده از من میخواد خداحافظی بکنه.
He cautioned me, and only as the Shah could do, and you'd have to know him and see him looking at you through his glasses with his penetrating look, that I should not forget who the King of Kings was.
I saw him only once when he accompanied the American ambassador to come and inquire about the date of my departure and even the hour of my departure. That's all I discussed with General Heisen.
Now that's interesting, because General Heisen says something that probably didn't happen, because the Shah says later on that I only saw him with the American ambassador, which would have been the proper way. Heisen would have had no, there was no protocol for an American general to just come to the palace to see the king. He has to follow protocol. The protocol would have been to go with the US embassy, because the US ambassador was the official representative of the United States government in Iran, not the general. So I disbelieve the general. I don't know who he is. General Heisen. Who is he? He could be anybody. Don't know his background. I don't know his allegiance. I don't know the inner man's inner emotions, his motives, and even more importantly, his ulterior motive, which he would never confess to anyway. No man would. But it's quite clear that Carter sent this General Heisen to Iran to defuse the military. In fact, if you watch this documentary at length, and you should, especially the first part, there is a section in which one of the Shah's former ministers, or he might be a military man, I can't remember his name, but he comes out and says that, you know, he basically came here and told all us generals, heads of different divisions of the armed forces, to step down and not to follow orders or anything that they might, any ideas they might get in crushing quelling the revolution. I believe them. I know some of them. I've met them. They would not lie because there's nothing in it for them. They're all dead now anyway. So they had nothing to gain by lying. General Heisen does a lot to gain by lying. Their time came to an end. Their king left. Their titles and their prestige went away. They had nothing to gain from this. I'm sure General Heisen has had a lot to gain, and I'm sure he's still benefiting from that gain.
A section of the military was determined to stop Khomeini by any means.
بحث این بود که در اول که جلوش گرفته بشه و نیاد. حتی پیشنهاد این بود که یکی دو تا پیشنهادم که داشتیم این بود که اصلا هواپیمای یا هلیکوپتر که ایشون بیان استفاده کنن زده بشه رو هوا.
In France, Khomeini's advisors agonized over the right moment to return.
یه شب بعد از نماز مغرب عشا که امام آمدن تو اتاق که ما بودیم همه، گفتن که من به ذهنم رسیده دیگه بودن ما اینجا وجهی نداره، بریم به ایران.
بعدم گفتن خب شما مجبور نیستید با من بیاید، این یه سفر خیلی میتونه خطرناکی باشه.
ما هم فکر میکردیم که هر چقدر تعداد خبرنگار بیشتر باشه بیمه‌ای برای اون هواپیما و اون هواپیما امن‌تر خواهد بود، چون این خطر بود که ممکن بود هواپیما رو سرنگون بکنه.
I will not forget the hospitality of the French government and the French people and their sense of liberty.
So, one of the reasons why I know that these Shah's men don't lie about such things is because, you know, here he is on camera making a very candid admission that they had discussed the possibility of shooting down the plane. And of course, you know, Khomeini arrives in an Air France flight, which lessens the possibility of the Iranian government at the time, the military men wanting to shoot it down. So France knew exactly what it was doing. France had a role to play in all of this. And don't forget, you know, I did say that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was present at the Guadeloupe secret meeting with Jimmy Carter, Callahan, and Helmut Schmidt of Germany. So they already knew what they were going to do, and they knew how it was going to happen, and they had coordinated the entire thing themselves. Now, of course, the biggest question is why did the Shah listen to them? Why was he persuaded to leave? And the answer is very simple. It's not complex at all. I'll give it to you very simply because I'm interested in productivity and not activity. He left because he didn't want to act against the constitution. He didn't want to shoot his own people. He had always said no king should have blood on his hands. And that is the principle by which he lived and ruled. All of these conversations about him being disconnected from his people, he was no more disconnected from his people than King Charles III or King Charles II or Queen Elizabeth II. You know, it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in, there will always be some disconnection with other groups of society. This is normal. You cannot expect one man who represents head of government and head of state to possibly be in touch with every single segment of society. It's impossible. None of us can achieve any of that in a democracy, whether it's in the UK or France or Germany or the United States or the Netherlands or Belgium or anywhere else. It's not possible. So to hold those things against him is somewhat mischievous at best and rather duplicitous. I'm not interested in what might be possible, only in what might be probable. Because as far as possibility is concerned, well, we could talk, till we're blue in the face. It's not going to do anything, is it? But I wanted you to see this because I think it's important, because given the current situation, a lot of Westerners are very critical because they don't understand the situation. They misunderstand the situation, and they think that America is being belligerent and so forth. It's not being belligerent at all. It's actually doing the right thing. It's undoing what Jimmy Carter and Giscard d'Estaing and Callahan and Schmidt did in 1979, which was to create a green belt, an Islamic belt, in that region in order to dissuade any possibility of Soviet expansion and invasion. And you can argue that that perhaps was not the ultimate plan, that the ultimate plan was the control of oil, the control of shipping, the control of markets, and so on. Almost all of those arguments are plausible and highly probable. Now, whether criticism of what America is doing right now hinges on it being justified or unjustified, I think the argument very persuasively falls on the justified side, because it can't go on as it's going on. As you can see from the news, Iran has been belligerent towards its neighbors, whom it declared for years that they were its allies. Well, now we see that they were not considered as allies at all, because they have attacked every single one of them. They haven't just hurled rockets at Israel, but at Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Erbil in northern Iraq, and so on. Imagine if they really actually had a nuclear weapon. What would they do with it? What would they do with it? And more importantly, who would they do it to? I think this is a penetrating question. So for the moment, as it stands, this is a God-forsaken regime, and it's important for you to understand, when you're trying to create an argument to justify not attacking Iran and not wanting regime change, that you look at these documentaries and the evidence and don't just believe what you hear from academics and politicians and so on. All of these very kind of vivid analysis that are really not that analyzing. They're more like speculations. When an academic makes a speculation, they call it analysis. I know, because I used to be an academic, so I understand. I have a foot in each grave, as they say. I've been there, and now I'm here. Academics will almost create any kind of argument in order to justify the logic that they're trying to weave, and most of the time it's just rubbish, including what Abbas Milani says. I don't really put that much stock in what Abbas Milani has to say in terms of analysis, because I think his analysis is somewhat incorrect. He professes to have come from a kind of bourgeoisie background, came to America at the age of 15 and a half and studied and joined the Maoist group, and he thinks that was okay, and he probably thinks that he was under observation, under surveillance by the Savak secret police of Iran, and he would be wrong. He was actually under surveillance by the FBI. Almost all Maoists and communist students especially were under the surveillance of the FBI at the time. So it wasn't even Savak. So whatever information Savak was getting from regarding Abbas Milani's activities in the United States chiefly came from the FBI. Savak was not that penetrating when it came to surveillance outside of Iran. It kind of relied on its partnership with other Secret Service operatives in prospective countries. As I said, I think a couple of times, I think the next phase is ground invasion in Iran. I can see that happening right now. As far as the current contenders in state of affairs in Iran, Ghalibaf and Araghchi seem to be under house arrest. We don't know by whom. We can speculate as to why. It's always been said for the last 47 years within the Iranian community that are the most knowledgeable in some respects about what is happening and how it's happening, is that this regime, if is threatened in any way from the outside, would eventually eat itself. And that's exactly what's going on. This regime and its government and its proxies and its other forms of apparatus, operational apparatus, have no legitimacy whatsoever, and they know that. And this is the one thing that they have always feared throughout their existence in the last 47 years, is the fact that it is an illegitimate governance, for two reasons. Ideologically speaking, they are in breach of their own observance and oath, because under Shia rule, they are not permitted to govern. That position is held only for the 12th Imam that went missing, who they call the Mahdi, which, by the way, is a completely Mithraic concept. It has nothing to do with Islam whatsoever. And the second reason why they have this illegitimacy is because they're a bunch of nobodies. I mean, they really are. I can't think of a single one of them who actually occupies the position of being educated in any form. They are very, very afraid, suspicious of anyone that knows their particular topic and subject, because they're afraid of losing grip. And this is what eats at them the most, I think. And these rockets now exposing their truth is causing them to turn on each other, basically. It's a state of cannibalism. I mean, I think everything that you've seen that's happening on the news is a prelude to the inevitable end of these people, because their rule is completely illegitimate. It always has been. They have no legitimacy whatsoever. The fact that they started this entire project of theirs on the footing of war, hostage taking, name calling, creating jihadis and fatwas against writers and dissidents and anyone that opposes them. Many of our friends were murdered in London. Many of them. In fact, I went to university with one of them. His father, and there were many others that we knew on a social level, people we knew from Iran, and people who, in the intermingling of all the Iranian opposition groups in London at the time, we would meet them all, and we knew them, some of them quite intimately, in fact. This is the footing upon which this Islamic Republic, the peaceful, began. And any moderates within them, it's a complete and utter lie. They can never be moderates from any corner within this regime. Anyone who is a moderate in this regime, who is also associated with the religious aspect of it, who is a cleric, a mullah, them being moderate would mean that they would have to completely and utterly absolve themselves refrain from holding any government post whereby it is required of them to govern. Because like I said, it is against the Shia oath and rule and dogma, if you want to call it that, to have any position of governance. Guardianship, yes, but not governance. You may wonder what the difference is. Well, that's a semantic difference, but I believe that the difference in governance is whereby you make a decision, and in guardianship is where you mediate. So those are not the same things. Mediation is not governance. Governance is based upon finite and final decisions. Mediation is about reaching amicable solutions, if you like. They're allowed to do that, but they're not allowed to govern. So anyone who declares themselves as a moderate, who wants to become president or prime minister, well, that is a complete nonsensical position, because it would require for them to govern, and they're prohibited from doing so. So that is the ideological explanation, which furthers the argument of their illegitimacy. But I think ground invasions are inevitable, and I think it's a must. It must happen. It is the only way to end any war decisively. And again, I think what we've been seeing, the dismantling of their apparatus from the air and precision targeting, is merely a prelude to the eventual ground invasion, which by and large, I think will be tremendously welcomed. It's the only way to diffuse this regime completely and utterly from any form of governance and authority. The question, of course, lies in, what would happen afterwards. And of course, in my mind, I think the only feasible solution is for the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi to return and assume some form of governance to begin with, and then we'll see what happens. But as far as declaring a republic or a democracy from the very beginning, there is no precedent for this. It would be a complete shambles, I think, in my opinion. One, because, how do you even begin to define this democracy in a country like Iran or a republic? And secondly, there's no historical precedence for it. It's, if you look at all of the Western democracies that exist in Western Europe, it has been a very gradual, almost at a snail's pace, crawl towards this objective. To suddenly thrust it upon 19 million people, it may become a Pyrrhic victory. I don't think it would work. I just don't think it would work. Anyway, you can tell me what you think. We can discuss these things a little bit more, but we'll see what happens in the news later on, and I'll give you some of my perspective about it. The historical references are just there to kind of create a framework for you, if you like, a frame of reference within which we can have other discussions. And I think it's important to have that. We can't talk about You can't talk about any political situation without looking at the historical aspect of it too. This is very important because it is those historical events that have shaped the political climate in which we are in. And in order to dismantle and understand the political situation, we have to always refer to what has happened in the past in order to analyze the actions of individuals, the actions of institutions, certainly the decisions of individuals and the decisions of groups. Thank you very much. Javeed Shah, long live Iran, Zindabad Iran, and I wish you well. Thank you.